In today's tutorial, I'm going to break down how to turn a video clip into a rotoscoped animation using a free AI software called EbSynth in conjunction with Adobe Creative Cloud. Let's begin. Hello everyone, my name is Elliot, also known as Eliano, and today we're going to be looking at this great, completely free AI software called EbSynth, which allows you to transform video clips into rotoscoped animations. With this effect achieved by basically tracing over a few frames of your video clip, and this amazing software will simply do the rest. In order to create this type of video, you'll need EbSynth, Adobe Creative Cloud, with Adobe After Effects, Photoshop, Illustrator, and Media Encoder downloaded. Step 1. Preparing your footage. The first thing you're going to want to do is open a new project in Adobe After Effects. You will need to drag your footage into the project tab. You can do this by dragging it in through your Finder window, or by clicking File, Import, and selecting the footage that you want to bring in. From here, double click on the video file and it will appear as a layer panel in the center of your screen. Use your cursor to drag across the timeline of the video, or by clicking the spacebar to pause and play the video. You can also move forwards and backwards one frame at a time by clicking the Command key plus either the left or right arrow keys. Once you've found the section you want to convert to an animation, use these buttons to set in and out points. Now from here you're going to want to get your footage into a new composition. To do that you simply need to drag the video file from the project window over to this film clip icon, which will then make a new composition featuring your clip and keep your footage in its original frame rate and size settings. Now I want this video to be a square file, so I'm going to change the composition settings by clicking Command K or by going to the Composition tab and selecting Composition Settings. Then I just simply need to change the pixel settings of the height and width to 1080 pixels. Now to keep the footage in line with this new composition size, I'm going to change the positioning of the video clip by clicking the P button with the layer selected in the timeline. Now I'm going to click on this diamond shape here, and that's going to allow me to add a keyframe. And by dragging the first number here up and down, I'll be able to move the video to the left and right and make it close to the center. Do this with a couple of keyframes until your footage is perfectly aligned. Now you're ready to render out your reference frames to go into the EbSynth software. Simply click the Composition tab at the top of the window and click Add to Render Queue. This will load up the render queue on your timeline. Click this lossless hyperlink and you will be able to choose the type of file you want to export to. Click the drop down menu and select PNG sequence. After that, click on this hyperlink on the Output To tab, and from here you can select where you want to save your frames. I'm going to save it into a folder called Reference Footage Frames. From there you can click the render button and you will now have all your frames ready to edit in Photoshop. But before doing that, I would recommend creating a duplicate of your clip in another composition and use the Roto Brush tool to cut the background of the clip out. It's a fairly simple process and will save a lot of work later on. You don't need to do this, and if you want to skip, click to this time in the video. Just double tap on your clip whilst it's in the timeline of a composition, and when it appears as a layer panel in the middle, click this man and paintbrush icon. Now when the colour of your cursor is green and you select parts of your video, that is the part of the video that you want to keep displayed throughout your footage. Essentially what you're going to be doing right now is tracing over the sections of your video that you want to keep in and cut out. In the case of this clip, I obviously want to keep Lionel Messi within the footage, and I want to get rid of all of the background footage. Now if there are some sections here that you want to get rid of because the software hasn't completely tracked it, you can also hold down the Alt key and that will change your cursor to red. Now anything that you highlight in red will be removed from the video clip, as opposed to everything in green, everything that remains in the video clip. If you want to increase the size of the brush, simply hold down the Command key and then scroll your touchpad or mouse up and down and it will increase in size accordingly. Now if you want to see the parts of your video that are going to be cut out highlighted on screen, you can click one of these three buttons here and it will help illustrate which sections of your video will be cut out. Also make sure that this little rectangle here is the same width of your video clip, that way when you click the spacebar it will render this section of the video. And then simply click the spacebar and Roto Brush will go through frame by frame and try its best to both keep and remove the sections of your footage as it goes through frame by frame. Now you can always go back and look through every single individual frame by clicking the Command and arrow keys to move one key at a time, and then simply highlight which areas you want to keep and get rid of in each individual frame. It isn't a perfect process, but this will save us a lot of work in the later stages of this tutorial. But anyway, enough about that, let's start drawing our reference frames. Step 2. Outlining your keyframes in Photoshop. After rendering out my reference frame, I've selected 3 frames that I'm going to be drawing over and then inputting into the EbSynth software. You want to choose frames which show the key poses of the subject in the video, that way you get the best results from the AI within EbSynth. I'm going to select the first frame, which happens to also be the first image of the sequence, and open it within Photoshop. From here I'm going to save the file in a folder called KEYFRAMES, and then I'm going to save it in its own subfolder named after the frame number, which is also what I'm going to save the file as. I'm then going to click this little cross within a square button in order to create a new layer. Now once we've sorted that, I'm going to add a brightness and contrast adjustment layer and place it above the image frame. And then from there I'm also going to add a black and white adjustment layer. This layer will contain our outline brush strokes. I'm going to select the paintbrush icon here in the panel, or I could do this by clicking the B button. I'm then going to change the settings by clicking this drop down arrow and make sure the brush is sized at 4 pixels. And then I need to choose a colour for the brush that isn't black, white or grey, so it stands out. I've decided to go for this red. And from there, it's as simple as just tracing over the outlines of the image. Don't worry if your lines aren't as neat as you want it to be. You can sketch out these outlines one little bit at a time. We basically just want to convey all the basic shapes within our image. And if some sections become unclear with it being black and white, feel free to toggle on and off the adjustment layers by clicking this eye icon here next to each adjustment layer. Now if you're wondering exactly how I do the eyes on these images, I just simply add a line that almost looks like the top of a hexagon, and then I just add a circle for where the pupil is. I've also made sure to include some extra lines for the hair on Messi's head and the fabric on the clothes of the kit, to make the creases and strands of hair look clearer on the frame, and also give it a little bit more of a comic booky sort of look. Now we're going to create a second layer below our outlines layer, and I'm going to change the colour to a blue, and now I'm going to trace around the shadows on the image. By using the black and white adjustment layer, I personally find it easier to see which areas of the image have darker sections, which makes it a lot simpler for me to create the reference for the shadows we'll be adding later on. Now that I've sorted that out, I'm going to save this Photoshop file with the image layer still open and all of the adjustment layers turned on. Then I will repeat this entire process for the other 2 frames. And with that done, we are now ready to bring our outline sketches into Adobe Illustrator. Step 3. Finalising your keyframes in Adobe Illustrator. Now we're on to my favourite part of this tutorial, and that's creating the reference frames here in Adobe Illustrator. To start things off, we'll create a new document with a width and height of 1080 pixels, and make sure you enable artboards in your document. Now you need to drop in your Photoshop file into the Adobe Illustrator document. Simply click the File tab at the top of the screen and then click Place, and then select your Photoshop file for that frame. Now make sure it's placed in the centre of your frame. You can do this by clicking the V key whilst the image is selected and then using these align buttons at the top of your screen. Then with your image selected, we want to head over to this Properties tab. From here, you simply lower the opacity of your Photoshop document to make it more visible when drawing over it. I like to set the opacity at 75%. Now click back onto the Layers tab and enable a lock on that layer, so we can simply hide that layer for later on when we're ready to export. Next, click this square with a cross button to add a new layer and rename it Outlines, which, as I'm sure you can guess, will mean that this layer will contain the outlines for our image. Now select the brush tool, either by clicking this icon in the tab to the left of your screen or by clicking the B button. And make sure you have the Brushes tab open in your window. If you don't see this Brushes tab, click on the View tab at the top of your screen and then click Brushes to have it appear. Now because I want an old school comic book-esque aesthetic to my keyframes, I'm not going to be using the default brush in Illustrator. To use the same brush I used for this project, I'm going to click this book icon here at the bottom of the Brushes tab, and then from there select the Artistic menu of brushes and then click on the brushes library called Artistic Ink. You'll then get this pop-up menu appearing, and from there I'm going to select this brush. I'm also then going to change the weight of the brush in this menu here by making sure this tab at the top of the screen looks like this. Make sure the stroke size is set at 0.5 pixels and then start tracing around your outlines. You can do this by just drawing it one section at a time. Don't worry, you don't need to trace everything all in one line. Now, one thing to note with this specific brush is that it will get thinner at the beginning and end points of the lines you create using the brush tool. So to make your line work look a bit more consistent, simply start drawing your lines in the middle of a connecting line and then repeat throughout. Now that we've done the outlines, I'm now going to create a new tab and lower the stroke size to 0.25 pixels and draw the stripes of the shirt on this layer. Then from that, I'm going to create another tab, and this will be where all of our facial features will appear, with the stroke size also at 0.25 pixels. And then for the last part of our outlines, I'm going to create a final tab for the lines on Messy's hair and clothes to represent creases and hair respectively. Now that we've got that sorted, let's reopen our Photoshop file and make sure we have our shadows layer turned on, and then click Command and S if it isn't. And then by clicking OK on this window that will appear in your Illustrator file, your Photoshop file will automatically render in Illustrator. This way you can go back into your Photoshop file, and if you need to make any more edits, or maybe you don't want to see a certain adjustment layer appear whilst you're drawing in Illustrator, you can do that and simply save, and then Adobe will automatically update it in your Illustrator file. Now let's call this new layer that we're going to be creating below all of our outline layers shadows. And now you will want to select the pencil tool as opposed to the brush tool over here on the side panel in your window. Now to start things off, draw around one of your shadow shape. Make sure the beginning and end of your lines connect, and then make sure that the fill color, whilst your shadow shape has been selected, is set to black. And then simply go into the Properties tab and set the opacity to 10%. And there you go, you've got a simple shadow that you can then use. And all you need to do now is simply repeat the process and draw around each shadow shape. If, however, your shapes aren't actually being filled in, whenever you select over it, you just see a slight outline representing where they are, what you can do is click on that shadow, and then by using the eyedropper tool, you can select one of the shadows with the fill visible, and there you go, the color properties will then be transferred over to that shape layer. Now this next step is optional, you don't have to add this, but I personally quite like adding it, is I'm going to create another layer and I'm going to call it highlights. This will be where, as I'm sure you can guess, is where all of the highlights on the image will appear. And this process is virtually identical to creating your shadows. I'm simply going to use my Photoshop image as a reference, highlighting the lighter parts of the image, and then simply make sure that the fill color isn't set to black, but is instead set to white, and then make the opacity 10%, just like before. And now you also have some simple highlights, adding just that little bit more depth to your image. And now, let's add some color. Similar to our different outline layers, I'm going to be creating several different layers for each individual section of the image. That way I can create a bit of a hierarchy and also keep things a little bit more organized. And then all you need to do is simply select the pen tool and make sure you've selected the right color. And then by using the pen tool, simply do dot to dot shapes using your outlines to guide you. And there you go, you've colored in your outlines. Simply repeat this process using as many layers as you see appropriate. Also, a little tip is that you should use basic shapes wherever possible, such as for the pupils in the eyes. That way you can save yourself time without having to draw over certain sections. And then once you've added all of the colours to each section, give it a once over, make sure you're not missing anything. In my case, I forgot to add the lines on Messy's hair. And then simply hide the bottom layer, and your first reference frame is now complete. And to save ourselves time from creating multiple documents for each and every keyframe that we want to use with EbSynth, we're just going to create a new artboard and repeat this entire process for our next frame. And to save ourselves even more time, just use the eyedropper tool to select whichever line or colour you want to use, and then just use the right tool, and then you can get straight into using it. And there you go, you can get started. Once all these frames are now complete, you are ready to export them. I'm going to export them individually by clicking the File tab, then clicking Export, and then clicking Export As. Then when you see this export window appear, make sure they're set to PNG files. And for each one, make sure you click Use Artboards, and then type in the number for each frame before exporting. Save them in the same folder as your PSD file, and make sure you save the document as the same name as your PSD file, as that will be their frame number when imported into the EbSynth software. And if any additional numbers appear on the file name after it's been exported, make sure you rename the file by deleting those numbers. And with those now completed, we're ready to start using EbSynth. Step 4. Rendering your footage in EbSynth. So now we're ready to bring our clips into EbSynth and start finalizing our animation. When you load up the software, you will see these three tabs. and you need to tell the software which files you want to use to create your animation. Let's start off with the Video tab. Click the Select button, which will open up a Finder window, and select the first image in your Reference Footage Frames folder. Then from here, do the same for the Keyframe folder and select one of your keyframe files that we exported as a PNG from Adobe Illustrator. Now before clicking Render, I would suggest clicking on the Output tab here, which will open up another Finder window, and creating a folder within your keyframe folder and call it Render. This will be where your footage will be saved to, and it just keeps things a little bit more organized, as EbSynth will create a random folder and you could very easily lose track of where it is. And then click Synth. The software will then create the frames based upon your reference footage frames and the keyframes you have drawn. Repeat this process for all of the keyframes that you've drawn, and then once exported, you're ready to bring them in for any final edits in Adobe After Effects. Step 5. Completing your animation. Now that we've got our frames rendered out, let's bring them into After Effects. But first, let's create a new composition to place our keyframe renders into. You can do this by clicking the Command and N key, and make sure its size is set to 1080 by 1080 and has a frame rate of 25 frames per second. To bring your files in, simply go to the File tab, click Import, and then click File, and select the first file in your keyframes render folder. But before importing, make sure you tick this box to import your files as an image sequence as opposed to an individual file. Now once your image sequence is imported into After Effects, we need to set the image sequence to the right frame rate before doing any edits. After Effects will automatically set image sequences to 30 FPS, which will make things look faster than we want it to, and it will just complicate things going forward. To change the frame rate of your image sequence, right click over it whilst it's in the project window, go to Interpret Footage, and then click Main. And from there, change this number, which is at 30 FPS, to 25 FPS. And now, you'll have the correct frame rate for your footage. Do this for all of your keyframe renders. Now to preview your footage, double click on it in the project window, and you will inevitably see some distortion and warping on your footage. This will be due to the AI in EbSynth confusing certain sections and colouring them in by mistake. It's worth noting that EbSynth, in my experience, works much better with footage captured on a green or blue screen. But how do we solve this? Well, we go back to that composition we created during step 1, where you cut out the background of your reference clip using the rotobrush tool, and we render that file out as an RGB plus alpha QuickTime file by adding it to the render queue. That way, when this file is reinserted into After Effects, you will see that the background section of that video is now transparent. Now you're going to want to drag that file into your new composition, and make sure it's set in the same place as your original reference footage. You can simply do this by copying and pasting keyframes, or just by moving it around until it looks right. And then you want to drag one of your keyframe rendered image sequences underneath it within this composition. And then from there, change the track matte settings on your image sequence in this tab here from none to alpha matte. And now your image sequence render will only be displayed within the visible parts of the clip above. That way, any distortion which would have appeared due to the tracking within EbSynth has now been greatly reduced. Now repeat this step for all of your image sequence renders in the composition, and have it set up where you have your RGB plus alpha file above it. And then you want to cut your image sequences in the composition to the order that you want them to appear in. Now, as you can see, the renders from these image sequences aren't completely accurate. Now, the simplest way would be to go back and redraw a couple more keyframes, repeat the process until you get it exactly right. And now we could do that and make the footage look as perfect as possible, but I feel that would take up more time than is needed, considering EbSynth is meant to drastically cut down the amount of time needed for rotoscoping. So here are a few tips that you can use on your animations with the already completed assets you've done from just a couple keyframes. That way you don't have to go and redo the whole process of creating individual keyframes. First, you can duplicate your image sequence by clicking Command and D to make an exact copy of it. And then by using the pen tool located here, you can create a mask around that layer, which means that anything within that mask will only be shown. You can lower the opacity by clicking the T button whilst the layer is selected and changing this number. This way is a lot easier to see where you're placing your layer. And then you can simply move that layer in line with the footage above by adding keyframes to the position, scale, and rotation, and simply just move frame by frame where appropriate. For example, you've got a section that is perfect but gets cut off by a layer on top of it. you could just cut that out and place that over the top. Now, if you want to remove a color off of that layer, say for example with this section, I don't actually need the skin tone within this masked layer that I've just created, I can simply remove that color by going to the Effects tab and selecting Color Range. You simply drag this effect onto your layer, and then when this menu appears, use this eyedropper tool and you can pick the color that you want to remove. And with just a little bit more tweaking, you can see that we've added the eyes from one clip to another. Using the mask tool in this way can save you a lot of time recreating and re-rendering a whole new set of keyframes. One of the things that EbSynth can sometimes struggle with is detecting changes within faces. Now say for example with this section, I'm happy with the mask, but I think it shows too much of the image. You can add a layer called Simple Choker, and what that will do in conjunction with the color range effect is it will remove the edges within that layer, basically meaning it will shave off little bits of the side of the image. So if you want things to be a little bit thinner, to blend in a little bit better, you can do it this way. Now say for example you want to mask out a section of one of your image sequences, but you don't want it to change each frame. You basically just want a still image from this image sequence. You want this exact frame and you want to be able to manipulate it each and every frame. Well, by selecting that layer and clicking Command-Option-T, you will have added an effect called Time Remap. What this does is it gives every frame on your layer a number with a beginning and end keyframe shown here. Simply make a keyframe on the frame of this image sequence that you want to edit and remove the beginning and or end keyframe, and now that layer will be frozen at that exact point. And now you can move it around using the position, scale, and rotation, and you can use this to clean up your footage. Another way you can make the cuts between each of your image sequences is by lowering the frame rate of your composition. I do this mainly because I want my footage to look closer to traditional hand-drawn animation drawn on 2s. And in my personal opinion, most EbSynth videos that I've seen that are done at a higher frame rate tend to look quite jarring. But if we change the composition settings directly within this composition, we'll screw up the keyframes we've made for any edits. So not to cause any further issues, I'm going to add an adjustment layer over the top of all my footage by clicking Layer, New, and Adjustment Layer, which will then insert it into our composition, and then I'm going to add the effect Posterize Time, and then change the number to 12.5 frames per second. This will essentially cut out every other frame in my composition. And will also mean, if I keep this adjustment layer turned on, I only need to do half the amount of keyframes for any edits. Now say you want to add a shape layer over a section of your footage to complete it, such as on the hand here in this shot. Well, you can do this by simply adding a shape layer. Simply go to Layer, New, and Shape Layer, set the stroke and fill to match that section that you're drawing over, and then use the pen tool to draw that section. Make sure the stroke size matches the outlines on your footage, and then go to the drop-down menus until you find the Path tab. Open it, and then click on the stopwatch to create a keyframe. And by just changing the anchor points you've created on this shape each and every frame, you can fill in sections pretty quickly. And by reusing these techniques on various sections within my composition, I was able to clean up my animation to the point where I was a lot happier with it. After adding these tweaks to my footage, I then renamed the composition and created another composition, again sized at 1080 by 1080 at 25 frames per second, and dragged my composition containing my edited animation into this new one. I then added a solid layer for the background and set it to the same colour as the red on Messi's shirt. Now, one of the issues of using the alpha matte method that we use to cut out any of the distortion and warping on our image sequences is that it will cut out some of the outlines within our image sequences. As you can see with the background here blending into the shirt on our footage. But to get around this, we can simply use the Simple Choker effect to add an outline to our footage, as you can see here. Now all we need to do is change this white outline colour to match the colour of our outlines on our footage. So to do this, you duplicate the layer with the Simple Choker added and altered to match the thickness of your footage, delete the Simple Choker on the top layer, and then add a fill effect on the duplicate layer to make the whole clip that outline colour. And just like that, you have an outline again on your footage. And then to finish things off, I added another adjustment layer with Posterize Time set to 12.5 frames per second to keep everything consistent. I added a noise layer below this adjustment layer and set it to multiply. as it was on a white background and I wanted to add some grain to my footage. And then last but not least, I added some simple animated text behind my footage layers, set it to FC Barcelona's yellow, and I used the free plugin Animation Composer with some of its standard animations to make the text pop in. And now that I'm happy with that, I'm ready to export it. You can export it by clicking the Composition tab and then selecting Add to Media Encoder Queue. And I then set my export settings to H.264 with it set to match source settings at a high bitrate. And then make sure you click this hyperlink to select where you want to save your footage, click the play button, and now you have completed your animation. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure to hit that like button, as well as clicking subscribe with the notification bell enabled so you can make sure you don't miss out on any future uploads on this channel. And I want to say a massive thank you to those of you that have already subscribed after I released my rotoscope animation tutorial, my first video on YouTube in many years, and I'm so pleased to say I've already hit 100 subscribers on this channel. So once again, thank you very much. Also, feel free to leave a comment on this video if there's any sections of this tutorial that maybe you didn't quite understand or weren't explained clearly. I had a lot of issues trying to get this video out and it ended up being a lot longer than I initially wanted it to. But hopefully if you watched this you enjoyed it, but also feel free to leave a comment letting me know if there's any other things in motion design that you guys might want to learn by having a look over on my Instagram page and seeing if there's any techniques that interest you. Thanks again, I'll see you next time, cheers.